The shovel hit something solid 2 feet beneath the rose bushes, and Miriam Carter's breath caught in her throat. She had tended these gardens for 12 years, pruning and weeding and planting, never knowing what lay buried beneath her careful rows. But tonight, with her sister's screams still echoing in her memory and the auction block's shadow stretching across her soul, she dug with a fury that turned soil into weapon. The moon watched as she pulled the first metal box from the earth, its lock already rusted through. Inside, letters tied with silk ribbon, banknotes that could buy 100 lives like hers, and deeds that named names she recognized, names that would make the whole county tremble. By dawn, every secret would scatter like autumn leaves, and the woman who had been invisible for so long would become unforgettable. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The Garrison plantation stretched across 3,000 acres of Virginia soil, a kingdom of tobacco and cotton that had flourished for 3 generations on the backs of 200 souls who would never taste freedom. The big house stood at the center of it all, white columns gleaming in the sunlight like the bones of something ancient and terrible. Around it, the world existed in carefully maintained order, every person knowing their place, every rule written in blood and silence. Miriam Carter had been born in a cabin at the edge of the eastern fields 28 years earlier, delivered by her grandmother's weathered hands on a night when thunder shook the walls and rain turned the paths to rivers of mud. Her mother had died 3 days later from fever, leaving Miriam and her younger sister Ruth in the care of women who raised all the plantation children together. A collective motherhood born of necessity and survival. From the time she could walk, Miriam had understood the fundamental truth of her existence, that her life belonged to someone else, that her body was property, that her dreams were luxuries she could not afford. But she had dreamed anyway, in the quiet moments before sleep, in the brief spaces between tasks when her mind could wander beyond the boundaries of the known world. She dreamed of reading the words in books that lined the master's library, of walking down roads that led to places she had never seen, of speaking without measuring every syllable for danger. Most of all, she dreamed of Ruth growing up safe, of protecting her younger sister from the worst of what this life could bring. The gardens had become Miriam's domain when she was 16, after old Marcus, who had tended them for 40 years, finally succumbed to the lung sickness that had plagued him for seasons. Master Garrison had walked the grounds with her that first day, pointing to each section with his walking stick, explaining which plants were ornamental and which were practical, which required daily attention and which could survive neglect. He was a tall man with silver hair and a voice that never rose above a conversational tone, which somehow made him more frightening than the overseers who shouted and cursed. He spoke to her as if she were a tool he was calibrating, adjusting her settings for optimal performance. "These gardens reflect on the family," he had said, gesturing toward the elaborate beds of roses and azaleas. "Visitors judge a man by what they see approaching his home. You will maintain them to perfection, or you will be replaced. Do you understand?" Miriam had nodded, keeping her eyes lowered, her hands clasped in front of her worn dress. She understood more than he knew. She understood that perfection was her only shield, that excellence in her duties might buy her small mercies, that being invaluable could sometimes mean being protected. For 12 years she had made those gardens bloom with a dedication that bordered on art. She learned which flowers thrived in shade and which demanded sun, how to coax color from reluctant bulbs, when to prune and when to let nature take its course. The other enslaved people sometimes teased her gently about the care she took, the hours she spent on her knees in the soil, but they also understood. Everyone found their own way to survive. Ruth had grown up in those gardens, following Miriam around with a watering can too heavy for her small hands, asking endless questions about every beetle and butterfly. She was 7 years younger than Miriam, born in a different cabin to a different mother who had also died young, but the bond between them had been forged in shared loss and mutual protection. Where Miriam was quiet and watchful, Ruth was bright and curious, her laughter a rare sound of joy in a place designed to crush such things. Miriam had taught her to read using letters traced in garden dirt, to count using flower petals, to think beyond the boundaries that hemmed them in on all sides. "Why do roses have thorns?" Ruth had asked once when she was 9 years old, her finger bleeding from a careless touch. "To protect themselves," Miriam had answered, wrapping the small finger in a strip of cloth. "Beauty needs armor in this world." Ruth had considered this with the seriousness she brought to all of Miriam's lessons. "Then we need thorns too." Miriam had smiled despite herself, despite the weight of knowledge that her sister was too young to carry but old enough to sense. "We have thorns," she had said quietly. "We just have to hide them better than the roses do." The years had passed with the rhythm of seasons, planting and harvest, winter frost and summer heat. Miriam watched Ruth grow from a curious child into a beautiful young woman, and with that beauty came a new kind of danger. The master's son, Charles Garrison, had returned from university in the North with ideas about agriculture and modernization, but he had brought back none of the abolitionist sentiment that sometimes filtered down from those regions. He was 25 years old, handsome in the way of men who had never known hardship, and he had noticed Ruth with the kind of attention that made Miriam's blood run cold. She had tried to keep Ruth close, assigning her tasks in the gardens where Miriam could watch over her. But a plantation was too large and the overseers too powerful for such protection to hold. Charles began finding reasons to walk past wherever Ruth was working, to speak to her with a familiarity that crossed every boundary of their positions. Miriam saw the fear in her sister's eyes, the way Ruth made herself smaller in his presence. And she felt a rage building in her chest that had no outlet, no release. One evening in early September, as the sun set behind the oak trees and turned the sky to fire, Miriam was pruning the hedges near the big house when she heard voices from the study window above her head. Master Garrison and his son were arguing, their voices raised just enough to carry on the still air. "The girl is an asset," Charles was saying, "but she would be more valuable elsewhere. The Hendersons are looking for house staff, and they have offered a premium price." Miriam's hands stilled on the hedge clippers. They could only be talking about one girl. "Ruth is young and healthy," the elder Garrison replied. "But Miriam is the one who makes these gardens what they are. If we sell Ruth, we risk Miriam's productivity. Grief makes people careless. Then we will make it clear that carelessness will not be tolerated," Charles said coldly. "Father, you indulge these people with sentiment. They are laborers, nothing more. The Henderson offer includes a breeding agreement, future offspring to be divided between the properties. It is sound business." The words hit Miriam like physical blows. A breeding agreement. They were going to sell Ruth to be used, to be broken, to produce children who would never know their mother. She pressed her hand against the hedge to steady herself, thorns biting into her palm until blood welled up, and the pain helped her focus through the terror. "I will consider it," Master Garrison said finally. "But I want a full accounting of all our assets before I make any major sales. We may need liquid capital for the new equipment you have been requesting." The conversation shifted to crop yields and market prices, but Miriam heard none of it. She moved away from the window on legs that felt disconnected from her body, walking blindly toward the slave quarters as darkness fell around her. She found Ruth sitting outside their cabin with the other young women, mending a torn shirt by lamplight, and the normalcy of the scene made everything worse. Ruth looked up with a smile that faded the moment she saw Miriam's face. "What happened?" Ruth asked, setting aside her sewing and standing quickly. "Miriam, you are bleeding." Miriam looked down at her palm, at the puncture wounds from the thorns, and she realized she was shaking. She pulled Ruth inside the cabin and closed the door, leaning against it as if she could hold back the whole world with her weight. "They are going to sell you," she said, the words tearing out of her throat. "To the Hendersons. Charles convinced him. They want you for breeding." Ruth's face went white, then red, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "When?" she whispered. "I do not know. Soon. They are still negotiating." Miriam crossed to her sister and gripped her shoulders. "We have to do something. I will not let them take you, I swear it." But what could they do? Running meant the dogs and the hunters' capture and punishment that would make death seem merciful. Appealing to the master's compassion assumed he possessed any, which 12 years of experience had proven false. Violence would bring swift retribution not just on them but on everyone in the quarters. Collective punishment for individual resistance. They were trapped in a system designed to leave no escape, no options, no hope. That night Miriam lay awake on her thin mattress while Ruth slept fitfully beside her. And she thought about everything she had learned in her years tending the gardens. She thought about the master's habit of walking the grounds every evening, always following the same paths, pausing at certain spots for no reason she could determine. She thought about the time she had found disturbed earth in places where nothing was planted, soil that had been recently turned and then carefully disguised. She thought about the locked boxes in the garden shed that Marcus had warned her never to touch, and the small iron key he had shown her once before he died, making her promise to keep it hidden. "Some secrets stay buried because they are too dangerous for daylight," Marcus had told her in his final weeks, his voice hoarse from the sickness eating his lungs. "But if a day comes when you need a weapon, child, the master has given you an arsenal. He just does not know it yet." She had not understood then, had assumed the old man's mind was wandering under the fever's influence. But now, lying in the darkness with her sister's fate hanging by a thread, she began to piece together a pattern. Master Garrison buried things in the gardens. Important things. Secret things. Things he trusted only to the silence of the earth and the discretion of the enslaved people who tended the grounds but could never reveal what they might find. The next morning, Miriam went about her duties with mechanical precision, but her mind was racing through possibilities. She observed the master during his evening walk, noting which rose bushes he paused beside, which sections of the ornamental garden he studied with particular attention. She saw him glance toward the quarters with an expression she could not quite read, and she knew the decision about Ruth was approaching its conclusion. 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning when mist still clung to the fields and the sun was a pale disk behind the clouds, Master Garrison summoned Ruth to the big house. Miriam was working in the vegetable garden when she saw her sister walking up the path, her shoulders straight despite the fear that must have been coursing through her veins. She watched Ruth disappear through the servants' entrance, and she waited with her heart pounding so hard she thought her ribs might crack. Ruth emerged an hour later, her face a mask of forced calm, and she walked directly to where Miriam was kneeling among the tomato plants. She knelt beside her sister, picked up a trowel, and began digging with hands that trembled. "Friday," Ruth said quietly, so softly that Miriam had to lean close to hear. "They are sending me to the Hendersons on Friday. The papers are already drawn up. Charles will escort me himself to make sure I arrive in good condition." Friday was 4 days away. 4 days to prevent the unpreventable, to fight the inevitable, to find a weapon in a world that had stripped them of everything. That night, after the lamps were extinguished and the quarters settled into uneasy sleep, Miriam slipped out of the cabin with the iron key Marcus had given her clutched in her sweating palm. She made her way through the shadows to the garden shed, a small structure tucked behind the greenhouses where tools were stored and supplies kept locked away from potential theft. The door creaked as she pushed it open, a sound that seemed deafening in the night's silence, and she froze for a long moment before stepping inside. Moonlight filtered through the single window, illuminating rows of shovels and rakes, barrels of fertilizer and seed, coils of rope, and stacks of empty pots. At the back of the shed, partially hidden behind a workbench, stood a heavy wooden chest bound with iron straps. Miriam had seen it 1,000 times and never thought to question its presence. Now she approached it with the key extended like a talisman, her breath shallow in her throat. The key fit perfectly. The lock turned with a resistance that spoke of years without use, and then the lid lifted with a groan of old hinges. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and smelling of earth and rust, were the tools of excavation. Not the common shovels and spades used for daily gardening, but specialized implements, narrow blades designed for precision digging, brushes for clearing soil from delicate fines, even a small lantern with a shutter that could direct light without spreading it wide. Marcus had been more than a gardener. He had been the keeper of the master's secrets, the one who buried and retrieved on command, who knew where every hidden thing lay sleeping beneath the flowers. And now he had passed that knowledge to Miriam, trusting her with power she had not asked for but desperately needed. She took one of the narrow spades and a brush, closed the chest and locked it again. Then she moved through the gardens like a ghost, studying the ground with new eyes. She had spent 12 years learning every inch of these plots, memorizing which soil drained well and which held water, where roots ran deep and where they spread shallow. Now she looked for the subtle signs of disturbance, the places where earth had been moved and replaced, where plants grew in patterns that suggested relocation rather than natural placement. The rose garden, she realized, was a treasury. The large bushes with their extensive root systems had been planted to conceal the spaces beneath them, their thorny branches discouraging casual investigation. She counted 17 plants that showed signs of careful placement, arranged in a seemingly random pattern that actually formed a rough map of the property boundaries. Wednesday night, with 2 days remaining before Ruth's sale, Miriam began to dig. She chose a spot at the garden's edge where she would have time to fill it in before dawn, where the shadows were deepest and the risk of discovery lowest. The spade bit into soil she knew intimately, moving past the topsoil she had enriched with compost, through the clay layer that held moisture, down to the rocky subsoil that marked the limit of root growth. 2 feet down, the blade struck metal. She set aside the spade and used her hands to clear the remaining dirt, her fingers finding the edges of a rectangular box roughly the size of a large book. She lifted it free and carried it to the shed where she could examine it by the shuttered lantern's light. The box was made of tin, sealed with wax that had cracked with age. Inside, she found a bundle of letters tied with ribbon, their paper yellowed but their ink still legible. She could not read well, her education limited to what she had secretly learned and taught herself, but she recognized names and numbers. The letters were correspondence between Master Garrison and various business associates, discussing transactions that seemed legitimate until she noticed the coded language, references to special cargo and private arrangements that suggested something hidden beneath the surface. Beneath the letters lay a ledger, its pages filled with columns of figures that documented payments made and received over a span of 15 years. The amounts were staggering, hundreds of thousands of dollars moving through accounts that did not match the plantation's official records. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in silk that had once been fine but now showed signs of decay, was a deed to property in New Orleans listing Master Garrison as owner of a building on Royal Street that operated under a different name. Miriam studied the documents by lamplight, her mind working to connect the pieces. The master was hiding money, large amounts of it in transactions that existed outside his legitimate business. The property in New Orleans suggested a secondary enterprise, something profitable enough to generate the wealth documented in the ledger, but secret enough to require this elaborate concealment. And if he was hiding this from the authorities, from his own family, then these documents represented power. She carefully returned everything to the box and reburied it exactly where she had found it, smoothing the soil and rearranging the mulch until no sign of disturbance remained. Then she moved to the next location, a spot beneath a large azalea near the garden's center, and began digging again. This box yielded more letters, these ones written in a woman's hand, addressed to Garrison but signed only with initials. They spoke of longing and secret meetings, of a child born and sent away to be raised by relatives in Richmond, of payments made for discretion and silence. Miriam realized she was holding evidence of an affair, of illegitimate offspring, of betrayals that would destroy the master's reputation and his wife's peace if revealed. The third box contained banknotes, actual currency in denominations large enough to represent a year's expenses for the entire plantation. Someone could live for decades on what lay buried beneath a single rose bush, yet here it remained hidden in the dirt like vegetable scraps. As dawn approached on Thursday morning, Miriam had excavated 6 hiding places and cataloged a fortune in secrets. She had found evidence of financial fraud, adultery, illegal business dealings, and what appeared to be blackmail correspondence with several prominent families in the county. Master Garrison had spent years constructing a facade of respectability while engaging in activities that would see him ruined, possibly imprisoned if exposed. And he had trusted the earth to keep his secrets, never imagining that the woman who tended his gardens might one day decide to make them bloom in a different way. She returned to her cabin as the first birds began their morning songs, her dress stained with dirt and her hands cramped from hours of digging. Ruth was awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with her few possessions already wrapped in a cloth bundle. "Tomorrow," Ruth said, not quite a question, not quite a statement. "They will come for me tomorrow." Miriam sat beside her sister and took her hand, holding it tightly. "Yes," she said, "but tonight everything changes." Ruth looked at her with eyes that held both hope and terror. "What are you going to do?" "I am going to dig up every secret buried in that garden," Miriam said, her voice steady despite the enormity of what she was proposing. "And I am going to scatter them across this plantation like seeds. By the time the sun rises on Friday, Master Garrison will have more urgent concerns than selling you to the Hendersons." "They will kill you," Ruth whispered. "Miriam, they will hunt you down and kill you for this." "Then I will already be gone," Miriam replied, "and you will go with me." She had been forming the plan even as she dug, each box revealing new possibilities. The documents alone represented power, but scattered evidence would create chaos. Questions would arise that demanded answers. The master's business associates would panic. His wife would demand explanations. The careful order he had maintained would collapse into confusion, and in that confusion 2 women might slip away unnoticed. But first, she needed to make sure the secrets flew far enough and wide enough that they could not be easily contained. She needed witnesses, multiple people who would see and wonder and talk. She needed the kind of spectacle that would spread through the county faster than riders could carry warnings. Thursday passed in a haze of final preparations. Miriam worked in the gardens as usual, noting with grim satisfaction that Master Garrison took his evening walk with obvious tension in his shoulders. He must have sensed something shifting, some change in the air that his instincts recognized even if his conscious mind could not name it. He paused beside several of the rose bushes that concealed his treasures, and Miriam wondered if he was calculating their safety, measuring the risk of his buried secrets against the profit of Ruth's sale. That evening, when the dinner dishes had been cleared from the big house and the family had retired to their sitting room, Miriam slipped away from the quarters one final time. She carried tools wrapped in cloth to muffle any sound, and she moved with the confidence of someone who had spent years learning to be invisible. The moon was nearly full, bright enough to work by without artificial light that might draw attention. She began at the far end of the garden, at the rows that concealed the largest cache of financial documents. The digging went faster now that she knew exactly where to excavate and how deep to go. She pulled the box free and carried it to the center of the garden, to the ornamental fountain that served as the focal point of the landscape design. There she opened the box and removed its contents, spreading them across the fountain's edge and the surrounding ground. Then she moved to the next location, and the next, working with methodical determination as the night deepened around her. Each box yielded its secrets to her hands. Each bundle of papers joined the growing collection arranged like an exhibition, a museum of hidden sins displayed for the morning's discovery. She found more banknotes and added them to the pile. She found more letters documenting affairs and schemes and lies, and she laid them out with the care she usually reserved for arranging flowers. By midnight, 17 boxes had been excavated and emptied. The garden looked like a battlefield where the weapons were words and numbers, where the casualties would be reputations and futures. Miriam stood at the fountain's edge and surveyed her work, this catalogue of corruption arranged in neat rows that would be impossible to miss when the sun rose. But she was not finished. She had one more task, one final gesture that would ensure the message could not be ignored or suppressed. She went to the tool shed and retrieved every shovel stored there, at least a dozen implements of various sizes and purposes. She carried them to the garden and planted them upright in the ground around the perimeter of the excavation sites, creating a forest of tool handles that pointed toward the sky like accusing fingers. Then, with great care, she took the largest shovel and carried it to the exact center of the fountain. She climbed into the shallow water, soaking her dress and shoes, and she planted the shovel's blade deep into the fountain's base. The handle stood straight and true, a monument to labor and revelation, impossible to miss from any angle of approach. Dawn was perhaps 2 hours away when she finally stepped back to examine the completed work. The garden was transformed, no longer a showcase of beauty and order, but an excavation site, a crime scene, a testimony to everything that had festered beneath the surface. Come morning, the master would walk out of his house to discover that his most carefully guarded secrets had bloomed like nightshade, poisonous and impossible to uproot. Miriam returned to the cabin where Ruth waited with their few possessions already packed. She washed quickly, changing into the only other dress she owned, and she braided her hair with fingers that no longer trembled. She felt strangely calm, the way she imagined soldiers must feel when the battle finally begins after endless waiting. "The patrollers will be changing shifts in an hour," she told Ruth. "There will be a window when the roads are less watched. We need to move north and east toward the river. If we can cross before daylight, we will have a chance." "A chance," Ruth repeated, testing the word as if it were unfamiliar. "We have never had that before." "We have always had it," Miriam said, pulling her sister to her feet and embracing her tightly. "We just did not know how to claim it until now." They left the cabin as the eastern sky began to pale from black to gray. Behind them, the quarters were silent, everyone still sleeping or pretending to sleep, maintaining the fiction of ignorance that might protect them from collective punishment. Miriam and Ruth moved along the familiar paths one last time, past the fields they had worked, past the big house that had loomed over their entire existence. As they reached the edge of the property, Miriam glanced back toward the gardens she had tended for 12 years. She thought of every flower she had planted, every weed she had pulled, every hour spent on her knees in the soil. She thought of Marcus and his cryptic warning of the key that had unlocked more than just a chest. She thought of all the secrets sleeping beneath the earth and how they had finally been awakened. The sun broke over the horizon just as they entered the woods that bordered the northern fields. Behind them, they heard the first shout of discovery, a servant's voice raised in alarm. Then more voices joined, a chorus of confusion and panic as people emerged from the big house to see what had happened to the immaculate gardens overnight. Miriam imagined Master Garrison standing at the fountain with the shovel rising from its center, surrounded by the evidence of his hidden life spread out like a judgment. She imagined him trying to gather the papers while servants and family members crowded around, asking questions he could not answer without incriminating himself further. She imagined the documents being picked up by curious hands, read by eyes that had never been meant to see them, carried away by people who would talk despite any threats or bribes. The secrets would spread like the roots of the very roses that had concealed them, pushing up through cracks in the carefully maintained facade, impossible to contain once they had broken free. And while the master scrambled to salvage what he could of his reputation and his fortune, two women would be running toward a horizon that had always existed but had never been accessible until now. They ran through the woods as the sun climbed higher, following deer paths and stream beds that would hide their tracks from the dogs that would inevitably follow. Ruth's breathing came hard beside her, but she never faltered, never asked to slow down. They had trained for this without knowing it. Years of physical labor making their bodies strong, years of carrying impossible burdens making their spirits resilient. By mid-morning, they could hear the sounds of pursuit in the distance, the baying of hounds and the shouts of men on horseback. But the woods were dense here, the terrain difficult for horses, and Miriam led them deeper into the tangles of undergrowth and fallen timber that would slow the hunters. She had studied these woods during rare moments of freedom, had learned their secrets the way she had learned the gardens, and now that knowledge became their shield. They reached the river as the sun approached its zenith, the water running high and fast from recent rains. It was wider than Miriam had hoped, the current stronger, but there was no time to search for a better crossing. She could hear the dogs getting closer, their excited barking indicating they had found the trail. "Can you swim?" Miriam asked Ruth, though she already knew the answer. Neither of them had ever been taught, had never had the luxury of playing in water that was only meant for washing and drinking. "I can try," Ruth said, staring at the rushing current with fear in her eyes. "If the choice is drowning or going back, I choose drowning." Miriam took her sister's hand and squeezed it hard. "We are not going to drown," she said with a confidence she did not entirely feel. "We are going to cross this river and keep running until we find people who will help us. There are places in the north where runaways are hidden, safe houses and brave souls who believe slavery is a sin. We just have to reach them." They waded into the water together, gasping as the cold shocked their skin. The river bottom was rocky and uneven, threatening to twist their ankles with each step. When the water reached their waists, the current began pulling at them with serious intent, trying to sweep them downstream toward rapids they could hear roaring in the distance. Miriam felt her feet lose contact with the bottom, and suddenly she was swimming, or doing something that resembled swimming, thrashing and kicking to keep her head above water. Beside her, Ruth was doing the same, their hands locked together so tightly that Miriam's fingers went numb. The current carried them downstream faster than they could cross, the far bank seeming impossibly distant as they fought for every inch of progress. Something struck Miriam's shoulder, a submerged log or rock, and pain exploded through her arm. She nearly lost her grip on Ruth, nearly went under, but then her feet found purchase on a sandbar that rose from the river's bed like a gift. She dragged Ruth onto the shallow ground, both of them coughing and sputtering, and looked back toward the shore they had left. The dogs had reached the riverbank, 5 or 6 of them straining at their leashes while the handlers argued about whether to attempt a crossing. Behind them, Master Garrison sat on his horse, his face purple with rage even at this distance. Miriam could not hear what he was shouting, but she could imagine the words, the threats, the promises of punishment that would make death seem merciful. She raised her free hand and waved, a gesture of farewell or defiance or simple acknowledgement that she had existed in his world and was now leaving it. Then she pulled Ruth forward into the deeper water, and they swam and struggled and somehow, impossibly, reached the far side of the river where the bank rose steep and muddy before them. They climbed using roots and rocks as handholds, leaving their pursuers on the opposite shore with no easy way to follow immediately. By the time the hunters found a ford or a boat, Miriam and Ruth would be miles away, moving through unfamiliar territory where their trail would be harder to follow. For 3 days they traveled through forests and fields, avoiding roads and settlements, living on wild berries and water from streams. They slept in hollow logs and under rock overhangs, taking turns keeping watch while the other rested. The sounds of pursuit faded behind them, whether because the hunters had given up or simply fallen too far behind to be heard. On the 4th day, they encountered a black farmer working a small plot of land at the edge of a clearing. He looked up as they approached, his eyes taking in their torn dresses and bare feet, the exhaustion written in every line of their bodies. For a long moment he said nothing, and Miriam prepared to run again if necessary. Then he set down his hoe and walked toward his small cabin. "Come inside," he said quietly. "You look like you could use a meal and a safe place to rest." His name was Joseph Bennett, and he was a freeman who had purchased his own liberty 15 years earlier and now operated a stop on what he called the Underground Railroad, though there were no actual trains involved. His cabin had a hidden room beneath the floorboards where runaways could hide if slave catchers came searching, and he knew the routes north through sympathetic towns and farms that would offer shelter. "You are not the first to pass through here," he told them as his wife Sarah prepared a meal of cornbread and beans that tasted better than anything Miriam had ever eaten. "And you will not be the last. The road to freedom is long and dangerous, but people walk it every day. Some make it all the way to Canada, where American law cannot touch them. Others find places to settle in the northern states, building new lives under new names." "Is there news from Virginia?" Miriam asked, unable to suppress her curiosity about what had happened after their escape. "From the Garrison plantation?" Joseph and Sarah exchanged glances, and then Joseph smiled, a rare expression that transformed his weathered face. "Word travels fast when a wealthy man's secrets become public knowledge," he said. "From what I have heard, Master Garrison is facing investigations from multiple quarters. The authorities are examining his business dealings, his wife has filed for separation, and several prominent families are demanding explanations for correspondence that proved highly embarrassing when revealed. The plantation itself may be seized to cover debts and legal judgments." Miriam felt something release in her chest, a tension she had been carrying since the moment she first drove the shovel into the earth. The secrets had not been buried again. They had spread and taken root and grown into consequences that would reshape the Master's entire world. She had wielded the only weapon available to her, knowledge hidden beneath flowers, and it had proven more powerful than she had dared to hope. "What about the others?" Ruth asked quietly. "The people still on the plantation. Will they be punished for what we did?" Joseph shook his head. "From what I have heard, The master has too many problems of his own to spare attention for punishing those who remain. And with his finances in turmoil, he may be forced to sell the property entirely, which could scatter the enslaved people to different buyers. Not freedom, but perhaps a scattering that might give some of them chances they did not have before. They stayed with Joseph and Sarah for a week, regaining their strength and learning the routes they would need to follow northward. Other runaways came through during that time, people fleeing from different plantations and different horrors, all following the same invisible road toward the possibility of freedom. Miriam listened to their stories and told her own, and she began to understand that what she had done in the garden was part of something larger, an ongoing resistance that took 1,000 forms but served the same purpose. When they finally left to continue their journey, Sarah gave them each a sturdy pair of shoes and a coat against the coming winter. Joseph drew them a map from memory marking safe houses and danger zones, towns where abolitionists operated openly and areas where slave catchers hunted with particular zeal. "Remember their faces," he said, pointing to the other runaways who had sheltered with them. "Remember that you are not alone in this. Wherever you go, you will find people who understand what you have survived and what you are fighting for. That is a kind of wealth no master can bury or steal." Miriam and Ruth walked north through the changing seasons, through states where slavery was legal but weakening and states where it had been abolished but prejudice remained strong. They worked when they could find employment that did not require papers or references, doing laundry and cleaning and garden work that paid poorly but allowed them to eat and keep moving. They slept in barns and churches in the homes of brave souls who risked prosecution to shelter the fugitive. They crossed into Pennsylvania on a night when snow fell soft and silent, transforming the landscape into something clean and new. They stood at the state line marked only by a post in the ground, and Ruth began to cry with a mixture of relief and grief that Miriam understood completely. They were free legally, if not yet practically, but the people they had left behind remained in chains. The victory was real but incomplete, satisfying and heartbreaking in equal measure. In Philadelphia, they found work at a boarding house run by a Quaker woman named Abigail Preston, who asked no questions about their past and paid fair wages for their labor. Miriam tended the small garden behind the house, coaxing vegetables and flowers from the soil just as she had in Virginia. But now the fruits of her labor belonged to her. Ruth learned to cook and clean for the paying guests, developing skills that might sustain her through whatever future she chose to build. At night, in the small room they shared under the eaves, they talked about everything and nothing. They spoke of the people they had left behind, wondering who had been sold and who remained, whether any had followed their example and fled toward freedom. They spoke of the master and his ruined reputation, finding grim satisfaction in the thought of him facing consequences for even a fraction of his sins. They spoke of their mother and grandmother and all the women who had come before them, the ones who had survived and the ones who had not. "Do you think they would be proud?" Ruth asked one evening as spring arrived and turned the garden green with new growth. "Of what we did?" Miriam considered the question seriously. "I think they would be terrified," she said honestly, "and relieved, and proud. All of those things at once, the way we feel ourselves." She had been writing, slowly and painstakingly improving the literacy she had taught herself in the garden dirt. She wrote down everything she could remember about the plantation, about the people who lived there, about the systems of control and the moments of resistance. She wrote about the secrets buried beneath the roses and the night she had dug them up and scattered them like seeds of destruction. She wrote so that someone someday might understand what it had cost to claim the freedom that others were born into without question. News continued to reach them from Virginia, carried by new arrivals on the Underground Railroad and by abolitionist newspapers that published accounts of slavery's cruelties. The Garrison plantation had indeed been sold to cover debts and legal settlements, its enslaved people distributed among several buyers. Charles Garrison had fled west to avoid prosecution for his role in his father's schemes. Master Garrison himself had died of a stroke 6 months after Miriam and Ruth's escape. His final days spent watching his carefully constructed world collapse around him. Miriam felt no joy at the news of his death, only a weary acknowledgement that one architect of suffering had exited the stage while the institution he represented continued its brutal work. Individual victories meant little while the larger system remained intact. But they meant something. They had to mean something, or else all the struggle and sacrifice served no purpose. Years passed, and with them came changes both personal and political. Miriam married a freeman named David Carter who worked as a carpenter and shared her passion for growing things. Together they cultivated a larger garden, selling produce at the market and saving money toward the purchase of land they would own outright, no master to claim the fruits of their labor. Ruth met a man named Jonathan Freeman who had escaped from Maryland and found work on the docks, and they spoke seriously of building a life together once the political situation stabilized. The nation was fragmenting over the question of slavery, battle lines being drawn that would eventually erupt into open war. Miriam followed the debates in Congress, the conflicts in Kansas and other territories, the growing abolitionist movement that demanded an end to the institution that had defined her early life. She attended lectures by Frederick Douglass and other speakers who had escaped slavery and now used their voices as weapons against it. She contributed what she could to organizations that helped runaways and fought against the Fugitive Slave Act, that made even free states dangerous for those who had fled bondage. And she never forgot the night she had turned the garden into a graveyard of secrets, the moment when she had transformed from invisible laborer into agent of destruction. That memory sustained her through difficult times, reminded her that even in the most constrained circumstances, resistance was possible. The powerful believed their secrets were safe because the powerless could not read or write or speak without permission, but that assumption had always been their greatest vulnerability. On the 20th anniversary of her escape, Miriam returned to Virginia for the first time. The war had ended, slavery abolished by constitutional amendment, though the struggle for true equality had only begun. She traveled with David to the place where the Garrison plantation had stood, curious to see what remained of the world that had shaped her. The big house was gone, burned during the war by whose hand she could not determine. The fields had been divided and sold to different owners, some of them freedmen trying to build farms on land they had once worked as slaves. The quarters had been torn down, their timber repurposed for other buildings. Every trace of the lives lived there erased as if they had never existed. But the gardens remained wild and overgrown but recognizable. The roses still bloomed thorny and magnificent, marking the places where secrets had once slept. The fountain stood dry and cracked at the center of it all, weeds growing through the stones, and standing upright in its base was a single rusted shovel, its handle weathered but still whole. Miriam walked through the overgrown paths, recognizing plants she had nurtured decades earlier. She found azaleas and hydrangeas growing where she had planted them, survived through years of neglect by the strength of their roots. She knelt beside one of the rose bushes and dug with her bare hands, curious whether anything remained buried beneath it. Her fingers found metal, a tin box that had somehow survived 2 decades of rain and roots. She pulled it free and opened it to discover that water had seeped inside, turning the papers to pulp and the ink to smears. The secrets were finally gone, dissolved into nothing, their power dissipated like morning dew. She sat back on her heels and looked at the rusted shovel in the fountain, that monument to a single night of defiance. Someone had left it there deliberately, she realized, unearthed, recognizing its significance and choosing to preserve it as a marker of what had happened. Perhaps one of the other enslaved people who had remained, who had witnessed the aftermath and understood what it represented. Perhaps a stranger who had heard the story and wanted to honor it. "What are you thinking?" David asked, coming to stand beside her with his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "That some things stay buried and some things bloom," Miriam said, standing and brushing the dirt from her hands. "And sometimes the difference between the two is simply the courage to use a shovel." She took Ruth's hand and David's, these two people who had become her family and freedom the way others had been in bondage. And she led them away from the ruins of the past toward the road that would carry them back to Philadelphia. Behind them, the gardens continued their slow return to wilderness, roses blooming among the weeds, thorns protecting beauty that no longer served any master's purpose. The story of Miriam Carter and the night she dug up the master's secrets became part of the larger narrative of resistance and liberation, told and retold in different versions, embellished and simplified according to the needs of each telling. Some accounts made her a hero larger than life, attributing to her more courage and cunning than any single person could possess. Others reduced the tale to a simple act of revenge, missing the calculated strategy and desperate love that had motivated every action. But Miriam knew the truth, carried it in her bones the way she carried the memory of her mother's face in her grandmother's hands. She had been afraid and determined, heartbroken and furious, ordinary and extraordinary in the same breath. She had used the knowledge gained through years of invisible labor to strike a blow against the system that had enslaved her, and in doing so had claimed her humanity in a world designed to deny it. She lived to see Reconstruction and its promises betrayed, saw the rise of new systems designed to replicate slavery under different names. She lived to see her children born free, their births registered in official records that acknowledged their full humanity. She lived to tend gardens that belonged to her, to write her own story in words she had taught herself to shape, to stand in rooms where formerly enslaved people debated politics and strategy as equals among equals. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the work was done and the day's heat had faded into comfortable warmth, she would sit in her garden and remember a moonlit night when she had planted shovels like flowers and scattered secrets like seeds. She would remember the sound of the river rushing past and the feel of Ruth's hand in hers and the moment of decision when fear had transformed into action. She would remember, and in remembering she would understand that the story had never been just about her or Ruth, or even the master whose secrets she had exposed. It had been about the fundamental truth that no person could be property, that no secret buried deep enough could change that fact, and that somewhere beneath every carefully maintained garden of lies, the roots of truth were always waiting to break through into the light. The shovel remained standing in the fountain long after Miriam's final visit, a silent witness to the night when one woman's rage and love had rewritten the rules of what was possible. Eventually, time and weather brought it down, rust finally claiming what determination had planted. But by then, the story had spread beyond any single monument, taking root in the memories and imaginations of people who understood that resistance took many forms, and that sometimes the most powerful weapons were simply the truth and the courage to reveal it. In the years following her return to the ruins of the Garrison plantation, Miriam became increasingly involved in the work of helping newly freed people navigate the treacherous landscape of Reconstruction. The war had ended slavery as a legal institution, but it had not ended the hatred that had sustained it, nor had it provided formerly enslaved people with the resources they needed to build independent lives. Land that had been promised was often taken back. Jobs that paid fair wages were scarce, and violence against black communities erupted with terrifying regularity. Miriam and David opened their home to people who arrived in Philadelphia with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the determination to survive. Their small house became a way station where exhausted travelers could rest before moving on to wherever they hoped to settle, and Miriam's garden expanded to help feed the constant stream of visitors. She taught the skills she had learned, showing women how to coax vegetables from small plots of land, how to preserve food for lean times, how to create beauty even in the midst of hardship. Ruth and Jonathan had married and established their own household 3 streets away, and Ruth had discovered a talent for organizing that made her invaluable to the community's mutual aid societies. She coordinated networks of support that connected people who needed work with those who could provide it, that matched families seeking housing with property owners willing to rent to freedmen, that gathered donations of clothing and food for distribution to the most desperate. The sisters saw each other almost daily, their bond strengthened rather than weakened by the distance they had traveled from their origins. One afternoon in the summer of 1868, a young woman named Clara Washington appeared at Miriam's door with a letter of introduction from one of the Quaker abolitionists who had helped establish the Underground Railroad. Clara was 19 years old, recently escaped from a plantation in South Carolina, and she carried with her a story that made Miriam's chest tighten with recognition. "I worked in the master's house," Clara explained as they sat in the garden with glasses of cool water, the late afternoon sun filtering through the leaves of the apple tree David had planted. "I cleaned his study, dusted his shelves, emptied his wastebaskets. He thought I could not read, so he never bothered to hide his papers from me. But my mother had taught me letters in secret using a primer she had stolen from the master's own library." Miriam leaned forward, her attention completely focused on the young woman's words. "What did you learn?" she asked quietly. "Everything," Clara said, her voice shaking with suppressed emotion. "I learned about the debts he owed and could not pay, about the land he had mortgaged 3 times over, about the investments in Confederate bonds that became worthless when the South lost the war. I learned about his plans to maintain control over us even after emancipation, using debt and contracts that were designed to trap us in a new kind of bondage. And I copied it all down, every document I could, writing by candlelight in the early mornings before anyone else woke." She reached into the bag she carried and pulled out a thick bundle of papers, pages covered in cramped handwriting that documented years of financial manipulation and legal maneuvering. "I brought these with me when I ran," she continued. "I thought maybe someone could use them, maybe they could help stop what he is planning. But I do not know who to trust. Who would believe a former slave over a white landowner with connections and influence?" Miriam took the papers carefully, her hands remembering the feel of similar documents pulled from buried boxes 2 decades earlier. She began to read, her literacy hard-won but sufficient to understand the implications of what Clara had recorded. The master Clara had fled, a man named Thornton Hayes, was indeed planning to use the legal system to recreate slavery in everything but name, crafting contracts that would bind freedmen to the land through perpetual debt, establishing terms of labor that would pass from parents to children like an inherited curse. "You did the right thing bringing these," Miriam said, setting the papers aside and meeting Clara's frightened eyes with steady confidence. "And I know exactly what to do with them. There are lawyers now, black and white both, who fight these kinds of schemes in court. There are newspapers that will publish evidence of such corruption. The world has changed enough that your testimony, backed by these documents, will matter." Over the following weeks, Miriam helped Clara navigate the process of bringing formal charges against Thornton Hayes. They met with attorneys who specialized in representing freedmen, with journalists who were documenting the ongoing struggle for genuine emancipation, with politicians who had staked their careers on protecting the rights so recently won through war and constitutional amendment. The documents Clara had copied proved to be devastating evidence, and when combined with testimony from other people who had escaped Hayes's plantation, they painted a picture of systematic exploitation that could not be easily dismissed or ignored. The case became something of a sensation, reported in newspapers across the North and discussed in legislative chambers where debates raged about the future of Reconstruction. Hayes fought back with all the resources at his disposal, hiring expensive lawyers and calling in favors from old Confederate sympathizers, but the documentation was too thorough and the witnesses too credible. In the end, he was forced to abandon his schemes and sell his property to cover legal costs, and several other planters who had been implementing similar plans quietly abandoned them rather than face similar exposure. Miriam watched Clara testify in court with the same mixture of pride and sorrow she had felt watching Ruth grow into adulthood. Here was another woman using the only weapons available to her. Knowledge and courage combined to strike back against a system designed to crush her. The specifics were different. The historical moment had shifted, but the fundamental struggle remained constant. "How did you know what to do?" Clara asked afterward, when the verdict had been delivered and the immediate danger had passed. "How did you know that the papers would matter, that anyone would listen?" Miriam considered the question, thinking back to the night she had scattered secrets across the Garrison gardens, to the years of careful observation that had preceded that act, to all the moments of decision that had led her to this point. "I learned that powerful people hide things because exposure threatens them," she said slowly. "And I learned that even when we seem to have no power at all, knowledge is a form of strength that cannot be taken away. They can own our bodies, claim our labor, but they cannot control what we see and hear and remember. And when we find ways to turn that knowledge into action, we become more dangerous than they ever imagined possible." Clara stayed in Philadelphia, finding work as a seamstress and eventually opening her own small shop that employed other freedwomen who needed income and community. She remained close to Miriam and Ruth, the three of them forming a bond that transcended the specific plantations they had fled, rooted instead in the shared understanding of what it meant to transform from property into person, from powerless to powerful. The years of Reconstruction gave way to the years of betrayal and retrenchment, as the federal government gradually withdrew protection from the South and allowed white supremacist governments to reclaim control. The promises of land and equality evaporated like morning mist, replaced by Jim Crow laws and terrorist violence designed to push Black Americans back into subordination. Miriam watched these developments with a grief that never quite became despair, because she had lived long enough to understand that progress was neither linear nor permanent. That every gain had to be defended and every right had to be exercised or risk being lost. She began writing more seriously in her 60s, setting down not just her own story, but the stories of others she had met along the way. She wrote about Joseph and Sarah Bennett and their hidden room beneath the floorboards, about the conductors on the Underground Railroad who had risked everything to guide strangers toward freedom, about the women who had resisted in ways large and small, visible and invisible. She wrote about the gardens she had tended and the secrets she had unearthed. But she also wrote about the ordinary moments of joy and connection that had sustained people through unimaginable hardship. Her granddaughter, Anna, learned to read using the pages of Miriam's manuscript, and she asked endless questions about the people and places described in the careful handwriting. "Tell me about the night you dug up the secrets," Anna would beg, even though she had heard the story dozens of times. "Tell me about the shovel in the fountain," and Miriam would tell it again, each time finding new details to include, new perspectives to explore. She told Anna about the weight of the spade in her hands and the resistance of the soil, about the moment when metal struck metal and she knew she had found what she was looking for. She told her about the fear that had coexisted with determination, about the love for Ruth that had made the impossible seem necessary. She told her about standing in the garden with the moon overhead and papers scattered like leaves, about planting shovels in the ground like a crop of truth waiting to be harvested. "Were you scared?" Anna asked, her young face serious with the effort of understanding. "Terrified," Miriam admitted. "But being scared and being brave are not opposites, child. Sometimes being brave means acting even though you are scared, especially when someone you love needs you to be strong." Anna absorbed this wisdom the way children do, storing it away for future need. She was growing up in a world that still denied her full humanity, that limited her opportunities and threatened her safety. But she was also growing up free, able to attend school and learn to read, able to dream of futures that her grandmother had only been able to imagine in stolen moments. That difference mattered, even when the similarities to the past felt overwhelming. David died in the winter of 1892, his heart finally giving out after 75 years of steady beating. Miriam mourned him with the depth of feeling that comes from sharing a life built from nothing, from knowing that you chose each other when choice was itself a radical act. They had created something together, a partnership based on mutual respect and shared purpose, and his absence left a hole in her days that never quite filled in. But she continued the work they had started together, tending the garden that had grown to fill nearly every available inch of their property, feeding people who needed feeding, offering shelter to those who needed sheltering. Ruth was with her almost constantly during this period, the two sisters drawing strength from each other as they had always done, their bond forged in slavery and tempered by freedom proving unbreakable even in the face of loss. On Miriam's 70th birthday, the community held a celebration in her honor at the church where she had worshipped for decades. People came from across the city and beyond, some of them former runaways she had helped, others the children and grandchildren of those she had assisted. They brought food and flowers, stories and songs, testimonies to the impact she had had on their lives, even when she had been unaware of making any particular impression. A young minister named Reverend James Crawford stood to speak about Miriam's legacy, his voice carrying clearly through the packed sanctuary. "Sister Miriam teaches us that resistance takes many forms," he said, his gaze sweeping across the congregation. "She teaches us that the tools of our oppression can become the instruments of our liberation if we are clever enough and brave enough to use them. She dug in gardens and unearthed truth. She tended flowers and cultivated justice. She used her hands to both nurture life and expose death. This is the work we are all called to do in whatever circumstances we find ourselves with whatever tools we have available." Miriam listened to the praise with embarrassment and gratitude in equal measure. She had never sought recognition, had never thought of herself as exceptional or heroic. She had simply done what needed doing when the moment demanded action, had used what she knew to protect what she loved. That others found inspiration in her choices was humbling, but it also felt like a validation of the fundamental belief that had guided her actions, that every person had value and deserved dignity, that no system of oppression could stand forever against the combined force of individual acts of courage. In her final years, Miriam spent most of her time in the garden, moving more slowly but with the same sure knowledge of what each plant needed and when. She taught Anna everything she knew about cultivation and care, about reading the soil and understanding the seasons, about patience and persistence and the satisfaction of watching something grow from seed to full flower. But she also taught her granddaughter about the other kind of gardening, the work of uncovering hidden truths and exposing buried wrongs, of using knowledge as a weapon when circumstances demanded it. "The world will tell you that you are powerless," Miriam said one afternoon as they worked together pulling weeds from between the tomato plants. "It will try to convince you that your voice does not matter, that your actions cannot change anything. Do not believe those lies, Anna. I was a slave woman with no education and no rights, and I still found a way to bring down a master who thought himself untouchable. If I could do that, you can do anything." Anna nodded solemnly, her hands moving efficiently through the task at hand. At 14, she was already showing signs of the intelligence and determination that would carry her through a life of challenges and triumphs, and Miriam felt a fierce pride in knowing that she had helped shape this young woman who would never know the particular bondage that had defined her grandmother's early years, but who would face other battles requiring similar courage. The night before Miriam died, she dreamed of the Garrison plantation as it had been in her youth, the gardens in full bloom and the big house gleaming white in the sunlight. But in the dream, she walked through those spaces as a free woman, touching the roses without fear of punishment, entering the house through the front door as an honored guest. Master Garrison appeared in the dream, but he was diminished somehow, smaller than she remembered, his voice lacking the authority it had once commanded. "You destroyed everything I built," he said, but there was more confusion than anger in his tone, as if he genuinely could not understand how she had accomplished such a thing. "I destroyed what deserved destroying," Miriam replied in the dream, her voice calm and certain. "And what deserved preserving I carried with me when I left. You never understood the difference, and that was your greatest weakness." She woke from the dream feeling peaceful, as if some final accounting had been settled. Ruth was dozing in the chair beside her bed, keeping watch as she had done for the past week as Miriam's strength gradually faded. Anna was curled up on a blanket on the floor, young enough to still sleep anywhere, old enough to understand that these were important days requiring her presence. "Ruth," Miriam said softly, and her sister woke instantly, reaching for her hand. "I am here," Ruth said, squeezing gently. "I am right here, just like always." "Do you remember the night we crossed the river?" Miriam asked, her voice weaker than it had been even that morning. "How scared we were, how certain we would drown or be caught." "I remember thinking I would rather die in that water than go to the Hendersons," Ruth said, tears starting to track down her weathered cheeks. "I remember holding your hand so tight I thought I might break your fingers. I remember reaching the other side and not quite believing we had made it." "We made it," Miriam said, a smile touching her lips. "We made it all the way here, to this room where we are both old women surrounded by people we love. We made it farther than I ever thought possible that night in the river." "Because of what you did," Ruth said fiercely. "Because you were brave enough to dig up those secrets and smart enough to know they would create the chaos we needed to escape. I have never properly thanked you for saving my life." "You saved mine too," Miriam replied. "Every day we have been together, you have given me a reason to keep going. We saved each other the way sisters do." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, hands clasped, decades of shared history flowing between them without need for words. Anna woke and joined them, and the three generations sat together watching the sun rise through the window, painting the garden gold and green and beautiful. Miriam Carter died peacefully that afternoon with her sister and granddaughter beside her, her hands still stained with garden soil because she had never stopped growing things and never would until the very end. She was buried in a cemetery for freedmen in Philadelphia, her headstone bearing her name and dates and one additional line that she had requested. She tended gardens and uprooted secrets. It was enough. It was everything. It was the truth that she had lived and the legacy she had chosen to leave behind. At the funeral, people told stories about her that would be passed down through generations, each telling adding new layers of meaning while preserving the essential core of truth. They spoke of her courage and her kindness, her determination and her wisdom, her ability to transform the mundane into the meaningful. They spoke of the night she had turned a garden into a battlefield and a shovel into a monument, of the way she had used the master's own secrets as weapons against him. But what they remembered most, what became the heart of the story that would be told and retold, was simpler and more profound than any single act of defiance. They remembered that she had been a woman who understood the power of cultivation in all its forms, who knew that sometimes you planted seeds and sometimes you uprooted weeds, and that both were necessary work in the ongoing struggle to make the world yield justice instead of just profit. They remembered that she had loved fiercely and acted bravely and lived fully, transforming herself from property into person through sheer force of will and careful application of knowledge gained through years of patient observation. Anna grew up to become a teacher, educating generations of black children in the segregated schools of Philadelphia and later in the more integrated institutions that emerged during the civil rights struggles of the 20th century. She told her students about her grandmother, about the gardens and the secrets and the shovel planted in the fountain, using the story to illustrate lessons about resistance and resilience, about using whatever tools were available to fight against injustice. Some of her students went on to become activists and organizers themselves, carrying forward the legacy of transformation that Miriam had embodied. The house where Miriam had lived remained in the family for 3 more generations, its garden continuing to produce vegetables and flowers under the care of her descendants. The apple tree David had planted grew tall and strong, providing shade and fruit for neighborhood children who climbed its branches and never knew the history it represented. The community that Miriam had helped build continued to evolve and adapt, facing new challenges with the same creativity and determination she had modeled. In the 21st century, a historian researching the Underground Railroad discovered references to Miriam Carter in documents held by the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society. Following the trail of citations and cross-references, she uncovered the full story of the night Miriam had excavated the Garrison plantation's secrets, a tale that had been partially lost to time but never completely forgotten. The historian traveled to Virginia and found that local records still contained references to the scandal that had destroyed the Garrison family's reputation, though the official accounts carefully omitted any mention of how those secrets had been exposed. She published an article in an academic journal and then a book, bringing Miriam's story to a wider audience who marveled at the cunning and courage it represented. The book sparked renewed interest in the many forms resistance to slavery had taken, the countless individual acts of defiance that had chipped away at the institution's foundations even before the war brought its legal end. Miriam became a symbol of the power of knowledge and the importance of documentation, of how marginalized people had always found ways to fight back even when every law and custom seemed designed to prevent exactly that. And somewhere in Virginia, on land that had once been the Garrison plantation, the roses still bloomed. They grew wild now, untended and uncontrolled, spreading across fields that had been divided and subdivided among different owners over the decades. Their roots ran deep into soil that had absorbed generations of secrets and sorrows, their thorns still sharp enough to draw blood from the careless, their flowers still beautiful enough to make people stop and wonder at the persistence of life in all its forms. The shovel had long since rusted away to nothing, reclaimed by the earth it had once disturbed. But the story remained, passed from generation to generation, adapted and embellished but never losing its essential truth. A slave woman named Miriam Carter had tended gardens on a Virginia plantation, had learned secrets through patient observation, and had used those secrets as weapons when the people she loved were threatened. She had dug in the darkness and planted shovels like seeds, and from that single night of defiance had grown a lifetime of freedom and a legacy that would outlive any monument of metal or stone. This was what it meant to cultivate resistance, to grow rebellion in the spaces between the rows of approved plantings, to transform the tools of oppression into instruments of liberation. This was what it meant to be human in circumstances designed to deny humanity, to love in systems built on violence, to hope when every rational calculation suggested despair. Miriam had done all of this and more, and in doing so had proved that no chain was unbreakable. No secret was safe forever, and no person was too powerless to change the world if they could find the courage to try.